They say the Caribbean sun rises the same way every morning. Yet on this particular dawn, something felt different. In the streets of Kingston, Bridgetown, Castries, and Port of Spain, a quiet trembling moved through the air, as though the ancestors themselves were clearing their throats. Elder men sat on verandas, leaning forward. Elder women paused while watering their plants, sensing a rumble not of the earth, but of the generation beneath them. For the first time in many years, the youth were not dancing, laughing, or drifting. They were standing firm, standing tall, standing as though the memory of centuries had suddenly awakened in their bones. Banners rose, voices rose, courage rose, and those elders who had lived through the winds of Garvey, Selassie, and the civil rights storm felt their hearts tighten with a familiar ache. This is not merely a story about protest. It is a story about recognition, a story about what happens when the young begin to hunger for the same dignity their grandparents once marched for. And if you are watching this from your living room, your porch, or your church hall, then stay with me now. Because something powerful is unfolding, and you must hear it. Before we go further, beloved elders, do not forget to subscribe, stay close, stay watchful, stay part of this awakening. The day it began, the Caribbean did not roar. It breathed, a long, tired, grieving breath, the kind a people release when they have carried disappointment for far too many decades. And then, as if guided by an unseen conductor, the youth stepped into the open. In Kingston, young Jamal tightened the straps of his faded backpack and joined a small crowd gathering near Halfway Tree. He was not a political speaker, not a scholar, not a man born with a microphone in his hand. He was an ordinary 20-something carrying an extraordinary frustration. "I just want a leader who stands like a mountain," he whispered. "A leader who does not tremble when foreign shadows lean over us." His voice cracked the way youth voices do when truth first meets fear. Across the sea in Bridgetown, Renee held a cardboard sign above her head. The wind kept bending it, as if even the breeze wanted to read her words. "We deserve leaders with spine, not strings." Cars slowed. Older women stared through bus windows. Some nodded, some wiped their eyes. A few folded their arms, unsure, careful not to hope too quickly. Barbados had taught its children to keep expectations modest, but that morning, modesty was nowhere to be found. In Port of Spain, Kwesi was recording a short message on his phone, standing beneath a mural of Marcus Garvey. "We were raised to believe we are small islands," he said. "But smallness is not our destiny. When one generation loses its courage, another must reclaim it." His video spread faster than he ever imagined, across WhatsApp groups, across church prayer circles, across Caribbean elder communities who recognized the tone. It was the tone of a child who had stopped asking permission. What ignited this region-wide spark? It was not a single speech, nor a single scandal, nor a single politician's mistake. It was something deeper, something older, something that had been simmering beneath the Caribbean soil for years. A slow erosion of trust. Leaders who spoke boldly in the campaign season, but folded quietly when confronted by wealthy foreign partners. Agreements signed behind closed doors. Loans accepted without community consultation. Promises repeated but never kept. But this time, the youth were not simply upset. They were awakened. They began sharing clips of leaders abroad who spoke without fear, leaders who stood in dusty fields, not marble halls, leaders who faced powerful nations without bowing their heads, leaders who looked corruption in the eye and named it. For many Caribbean youth, this moment became what some would later call an Ibrahim Traore moment, a symbolic awakening rather than a literal reference, a sense that leadership rooted in courage was still possible in the Black world. Yet the protests were not chaotic. There were no burning tires, no shattered glass, no clashes in the streets. It was a quiet uprising, a disciplined one. The sort of movement that made elders pause and say, "This feels familiar." Some were transported back to 1968, 1972, 1979, the years when they themselves had marched, prayed, and demanded dignity. What made this wave different was its clarity. The youth were not calling for a party, not for a man, not for an ideology. They were calling for integrity, for backbone, for leadership that does not bow to foreign pressure, leadership that does not treat the people like an audience, but like a family, leadership that speaks plainly, acts boldly, and protects fiercely. In Jamaica, a retired schoolteacher leaned over her gate and watched the young walk by. "Look at them," she murmured, "walking like they have somewhere sacred to reach." A taxi driver honked twice and raised his fist. An older Rasta on the corner whispered a prayer for their protection. In Barbados, two grandmothers stood outside a bakery, their shopping bags resting at their feet. "I never thought I would see this again," one said softly. The other replied, "Child, the young are carrying what we laid down, and we must not let them carry it alone." In Trinidad, Kwesi's video reached a church hall where elders were preparing for an evening Bible study. They watched the clip in silence, the room heavy with memory. When it ended, a pastor closed his eyes and said, "Lord, remind us that courage does not retire." One by one, across the islands, bridges formed fragile but real between those who had lived through the old struggles and those stepping into new ones. The protests grew, not in violence, but in depth. Young people made speeches, older people listened, some joined, communities debated, radios buzzed, rum shops argued, church halls whispered. Something long dormant in the Caribbean soul began to stir. But the unity was not perfect. Governments observed nervously. Some tried to dismiss the movement as youthful noise. Some warned it was destabilizing. A few demanded, "Who is influencing these children?" But the truth was simple. No outsider had awakened them. It was the weight of their own lived reality, pressing too hard for too long. And just as the Caribbean youth began to realize their collective strength, something unexpected happened, something that would take this quiet uprising and turn it into a regional reckoning. A turning point was coming, and none of them were prepared for what unfolded next. The turning point did not arrive with thunder. It arrived through screens, silent at first, then multiplying, then sweeping across living rooms like a digital hurricane. Short videos filmed by Caribbean youth began appearing everywhere on phones, on tablets, on community center televisions. Clips of young voices saying what older voices had whispered privately for years. The Caribbean was not just murmuring anymore. It was speaking. The first viral clip came from Jamaica. A young man, no more than 23, stood in front of a government building and said, "If leadership cannot protect us, then leadership must be renewed." His words were not shouted. They were spoken with the calm certainty of a generation that had run out of fear. Within hours, that clip found its way into the hands of Auntie Marlene in St. Lucia. She was sitting on her porch, shelling peas, when her granddaughter placed the phone in her hand. She watched the clip twice, then a third time, leaning forward as though the youth's voice carried a memory she had forgotten. "These children," she whispered, "they talk like we used to talk before the world tired us out." Her fingers trembled slightly, not from age, but from recognition. Across in Antigua, Uncle Desmond sat at a barbershop with 3 other retired men, waiting for his turn in the chair. The room was filled with jokes and music until someone's phone buzzed. A group of young protesters appeared on the screen, comparing the boldness they longed for with the timid leadership they had inherited. One of the men muttered, "Boy, look how the youth have more backbone than Parliament." But Desmond said nothing. He stared at the screen, jaw set, eyes heavy with the weight of promises that had never materialized. Then came the moment that lit the region. A Caribbean content creator uploaded a side-by-side video. On one side, a speech from a local politician wavering through excuses. On the other, a leader abroad calling out corruption without flinching. The caption read, "We want this spirit, not those strings." The comparison was sharp, it was painful, and it spread like wildfire. When an analyst described the wave of youth frustration as an Ibrahim Traore reaction, the phrase did not refer to any specific event. It referred to a feeling, the surge that erupts in a people when they witness a leader who refuses to kneel before external powers. Elders hearing the term nodded slowly. They understood. They remembered. In Grenada, Sister Claudette, known in her community as a woman of prayer and steady wisdom, gathered with fellow church mothers to watch the latest video circulating in the Anglican WhatsApp group. It showed Caribbean youth forming a circle, raising their hands, declaring, "We are small islands, but we are not small people." Claudette pressed her hand to her chest. "Lord," she murmured, "this is the fire we prayed would return, but the fire can burn or it can purify. Guide them." Her voice was a mixture of admiration and concern, the delicate balance carried by elders who love the youth fiercely, but fear for them just as fiercely. As the clip spread, the generation gap did not widen, it cracked open. On one side stood the youth, weary of waiting. On the other stood the elders, weary of disappointment. But between the two, something unexpected began to form. A conversation. Young people showed their frustration, but older people offered context. In Jamaica, a grandmother told her grandson, "We fought the same battles you are fighting. The only difference is that we were tired, and the world silenced us." He replied, "Then let us carry it together." She wept. In Barbados, Renee's clip reached a group of vendors at a market stall. One elder said, "These children are bold." Another replied, "Boldness is the birthright we left behind." In Trinidad, Kwesi's words were played through a loudspeaker in a fishing village. Elder men paused in their net repairs to listen. One said, "They walking with purpose." Another added, "I only hope the leaders listening too." But the leaders were listening, and not all of them liked what they heard. Governments issued statements urging calm. Some dismissed the comparisons, arguing that Caribbean youth were being misled by international media. Others scolded the young for disrespect. A few tried to project strength, but the people had grown allergic to empty speeches. Then came the editorial in a major regional newspaper, calling the youth uprising naive, reckless, and destabilizing. The backlash was immediate. Young people pushed back. Elders countered with memories of their own struggles. The comment sections became battlegrounds of generational truth. Churches, radio hosts, and community leaders joined the conversation. Some supported the youth. Others cautioned restraint. But everyone, even the quiet ones, felt the shift. Something irreversible had begun. And yet, as the Caribbean watched its youth rise with growing confidence, a heavy question lingered over the islands like a storm cloud gathering over calm waters. What would be the price? Because the consequences were coming next, and they would shake the region in ways no one had fully imagined. When a people speak softly, the world may ignore them. But when a people rise in unity, the world must respond. And so, in the Caribbean, the consequences did not arrive as a single blow. They arrived as waves steady, unrelenting, and impossible to turn back. The first consequence appeared in Jamaica. Jamal walked into his workplace the morning after the protests, expecting silence, maybe even disapproval. Instead, he found colleagues gathered around a laptop replaying his appearance in a community video. Some encouraged him, others warned him. A supervisor pulled him aside and whispered, "Son, speak your truth, but guard your job. Institutions do not like shaking ground." It was not a threat. It was the voice of a man who had lived through decades of change without ever being heard. In Barbados, Renee felt the second consequence. Her clip had spread far beyond her island, and now journalists sought her out. Some asked genuine questions. Others tried to twist her words into conflict. She felt the weight of misinterpretation press against her chest. "Am I creating trouble?" she asked her mother. Her mother replied, "Trouble only comes when truth is spoken in a dishonest world." Renee did not sleep that night. She felt proud but frightened, empowered yet exposed. The third consequence unfolded in Trinidad. Kwesi discovered that leaders were watching not with curiosity, but with concern. Local officials called meetings to address youth unrest. The language was cautious, but the tension was unmistakable. A friend warned him that some political figures saw the movement as a rebellion, not a call for accountability. But Kwesi pushed forward. "Accountability is not disrespect," he said, "and asking for dignity is not unrest." Across the Caribbean, the fallout continued. Governments issued softer statements the second time around, realizing the youth were not alone. Elders had begun to speak quietly at first, then more boldly. A retired nurse in St. Lucia wrote on social media, "These children are asking for what we asked for 40 years ago." A former trade union leader in Antigua said on radio, "If this is wrong, then we were wrong too. And I know we were not wrong." But the consequences were not only political. Some were emotional, even spiritual. In Kingston, a prayer circle formed outside a small Pentecostal church. Elders held hands with the youth and prayed for protection, wisdom, and unity. One elderly woman prayed aloud, "Lord, let this movement not be hijacked by anger, nor crushed by fear." In Barbados, small businesses placed signs that read, "We support peaceful youth voices." In Trinidad, taxi drivers offered free rides to young organizers. In Grenada, a group of elder fishermen invited young protesters onto their boats and told stories of past struggles, past betrayals, past hopes that never fully blossomed. With each of these acts, Caribbean generations moved closer not in perfect agreement, but in shared recognition. They all knew something fundamental was shifting, but with growing unity also came growing pressure. Some employers quietly monitored staff social media. Some pastors preached caution from their pulpits. Some politicians attempted to discredit the youth by framing them as manipulated. And yet, the people did not retreat. The youth spoke from lived experience. The elders spoke from long memory, and the region listened. Then came the most unexpected consequence of all: alliances forming. In Jamaica, Jamal received a message from two older men who had marched in the 1970s. They wanted to meet him. "Your voice reminds us of ours," they said. When Jamal met them in a small cafe, the three men shared stories of frustration that spanned generations. By the end of the conversation, the elders placed their hands on Jamal's shoulders and blessed him. In Barbados, Renee gathered with market vendors and school teachers to discuss what reforms the youth truly wanted. It was the first time she felt like the islands were not just reacting, they were planning. In Trinidad, Kwesi sat at a table with fishermen, mechanics, young students, and retired government workers. There was disagreement, laughter, long pauses, and long confessions. But something sacred was taking shape, a collective understanding. Still, consequences rarely unfold without cost. One evening, Kwesi received a message warning him to be careful. It was unsigned. He deleted it, but felt its weight long after. Renee overheard a politician criticizing young radicals, stirring unnecessary tension. She swallowed her anger. And Jamal saw an online argument escalate into vicious name-calling, leaving him shaken by how quickly unity could fracture. The consequences were complex, harsh, hopeful, messy, and meaningful. They showed that progress is never clean. It is carved through resistance, reflection, and courage. But beneath all the consequences, one question grew louder across the islands, whispered by elders, shouted by youth, murmured by those in between. If this movement continues, what will it change? That question now rests with you, beloved viewers. As elders watching from across the diaspora, do you believe the youth are wrong, or are they completing the fight your generation began? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And yet, the Caribbean was not the only one watching. Because beyond the shores of these islands, across oceans and continents, the world had begun turning its gaze toward this awakening, and what the outside world saw changed the story entirely. When the Caribbean speaks, the world does not always listen. But when the Caribbean rises, the world feels the tremor. And in the weeks that followed the youth awakening, something remarkable happened. International eyes began to turn, slowly at first, then steadily, then with undeniable interest. In the United States, Black radio stations in cities like Atlanta, Chicago, and New York picked up the story. Elders in those communities, many of whom traced their roots to Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad, or St. Lucia, leaned closer to the speakers. Commentators described what was unfolding as a Black Atlantic reawakening, a rising tide that echoed the movements of the 1960s and 1970s. At a community center in Brooklyn, a group of seniors watched a news segment on the protests. Among them sat Auntie Marlene, who was visiting relatives for the summer. When the reporter mentioned Caribbean youth demanding stronger leadership, she nodded slowly. "They think these islands are quiet," she said. "But quiet places hold old storms." Across the ocean, in London, scholars of African diaspora history wrote opinion pieces in major newspapers, calling the movement a generational correction. Some compared it to the long arc of post-colonial struggle. Others drew parallels with African youth movements rising on the continent itself. What many agreed upon was this: the Caribbean was no longer speaking in fragments. It was speaking in clarity. Meanwhile, elder activists in the United States began drawing connections. Videos from Trinidad and Jamaica were shared alongside archival footage of civil rights marches. People online commented, "The same spirit is returning." A retired bus driver in Detroit, originally from Antigua, told his friends, "The young in the islands moving with the same fire we had before the world drained us." That bus driver was Uncle Desmond, who happened to be visiting family abroad. He watched the Caribbean headlines from a small living room as rain tapped against the window. "History is not repeating," he murmured. "It is reshaping itself." Even African commentators were paying attention. Journalists in Ghana, Nigeria, and South Africa raised questions about Caribbean-African political alignment. Some asked whether the Caribbean might eventually seek stronger ties with the continent. Others wondered if this youth awakening might spread across the diaspora. Social media amplified it all. Caribbean TikTok clips appeared on African timelines. African podcasts mentioned Caribbean frustration. Black American YouTubers reacted to Caribbean speeches. And everywhere, the tone was the same. Honor, curiosity, and a sense that something long divided was stirring toward connection. Yet the most striking response came from older Black Americans, those who had lived through Malcolm, Martin, and the long march toward dignity. Many said they recognized the tone of the Caribbean youth. They heard not rebellion, but reverence. Not chaos, but calling. And in Grenada, watching one of these reaction videos from her niece's tablet, Sister Claudette clasped her hands together. "Look how far the echo travels," she said softly. "If the world is listening, then the islands must speak wisely." For the first time in decades, the Caribbean was not being examined as a tourist zone or a financial corridor. It was being regarded as a moral compass, a mirror held up to the global Black community. But attention brings expectation. Expectation brings responsibility. And responsibility brings questions that no island, no elder, no youth can avoid. Because across the Caribbean, one whisper was growing louder. If the world is watching, what must the Caribbean do next? And that question leads us directly to the road ahead. A road filled with possibility and peril. A road the youth cannot walk alone, and the elders cannot avoid. The Caribbean stood at a crossroads, not the kind marked on a map, but the kind carved into the soul of a people. The youth had spoken. The elders had remembered. The world had watched. Now came the most difficult part, choosing the road forward. Change is never born from noise alone. It is born when noise becomes direction. And so, in Kingston, Jamal found himself sitting at a wooden table in a community center beneath flickering fluorescent lights. Around him were teachers, mechanics, mothers, retired union workers. The question before them was simple but heavy. What do we want the Caribbean to look like in 10 years? No one had an easy answer, but for the first time, they sat together, ready to try. In Barbados, Renee attended her first formal dialogue between youth voices and local officials. She spoke slowly, choosing each word with care. "We do not want chaos," she said. "We want clarity. We want transparency in every agreement signed in our name. We want leaders who talk with us, not at us." The officials nodded, some sincerely, some reluctantly, but the message had landed. The youth were not calling for the fall of institutions. They were calling for their renewal. Trinidad saw a similar gathering. Kwesi, now more cautious but more determined, stood before a mixed crowd of young activists, church elders, and small business owners. "This is not a battle between generations," he said. "It is a reunion. You built the foundation. We are asking to help rebuild the house." The elders murmured in agreement. A grandmother stepped forward and replied, "Child, if you build it with truth, we will stand with you." And across the region, 4 pillars of the road ahead began to emerge. First, transparency. No more hidden contracts, no more silence surrounding foreign agreements. Second, accountability. Leaders must answer to the people, not only during elections, but every ordinary day. Third, intergenerational partnership. The wisdom of the old and the fire of the young must meet, not compete. Fourth, a renewed Caribbean identity. One rooted not in fragility, but in dignity, courage, and unity. The road ahead would not be smooth. It would require patience from the youth and humility from the elders. It would require governments to listen in ways they were not used to. It would require the Caribbean to see itself not as scattered islands, but as one family stretching across waters. But even with this fragile blueprint forming, a deeper question lingered beneath the surface, one that neither youth nor elders could ignore. If the Caribbean chooses this road, if it truly commits to courage, truth, and unity, what future becomes possible? A future where the islands walk tall, a future where dignity becomes the norm, not the exception. A future where the diaspora, America, Africa, Europe sees the Caribbean not as small, but as sovereign. The next step would define everything, because the road ahead leads to a vision both powerful and uncertain, and the ending of this story has not yet been written. The Caribbean now finds itself standing in a silence that is not empty, but expectant, the kind of silence a people feel when they know history is watching. The youth have spoken, the elders have answered, and somewhere between those two voices, a new path has begun to form. It is still fragile, still uncertain, still trembling like a newly planted seed, but it is real. Across Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad, St. Lucia, Antigua, and Grenada, conversations that once felt impossible are now unfolding in living rooms, church halls, village squares, and market stalls. Elders are telling long-guarded stories. Young people are speaking with the confidence of a generation refusing to inherit fear. And both sides are realizing that dignity is not a memory, but a calling. For many, this moment feels like a second awakening, a spiritual echo of earlier battles for respect and sovereignty. Some have even described it as an Ibrahim Traore moment, not because the Caribbean seeks to mimic another land, but because it recognizes courage wherever courage stands. Others see in the youth uprising a symbolic Ibrahim Traore reaction, the emotional surge that rises when a people witness fearlessness and remember they were born with it too. And if this awakening continues, if the Caribbean truly leans into honesty, boldness, transparency, and unity, then perhaps, just perhaps, the region will step into its third great season of transformation. Elders will not be observers. Youth will not be rebels. They will be co-authors of a new Caribbean identity, an identity not shaped by foreign expectations, but by ancestral memory and generational courage. Imagine, beloved viewer, a future where small islands walk with the stride of whole continents. A future where agreements are signed in daylight. A future where leadership bows only to truth. A future where every Caribbean child grows up believing not in limitation, but in destiny. And as you picture that future, hold this close to your heart. Every great change in Black history began with ordinary people refusing to remain silent. This moment, this fragile, rising moment, may very well be another Ibrahim Traore moment in the long story of our people. Now I turn to you, dear elder, dear watcher, dear keeper of memory. What message would you give to the Caribbean youth who are standing up today? What wisdom, what warning, what blessing would you place in their hands? Share it in the comments. Let your voice become part of the record. And before you leave, beloved, do not forget to subscribe, stay with this community, stand with this movement, and help guide the next chapter of Caribbean Awakening.